very much. Just to clarify, the Southern Poverty Law Center and Media Matters are not civil rights organizations by any stretch of the imagination. They are far-left pressure groups that are trying to demonize and defame and ultimately marginalize anybody who dares to speak the truth about issues that the left does not want you to know. And so we here are in the subversive camp now, the analogous to the Soviet Union's secret meetings where people would gather to hear the truth that Pravda and TASS and the other organs of Soviet accepted opinion were not willing to tell. And so I commend you all for having the courage to be here. One interesting thing that Pat said in his remarks a few minutes ago was that Ronald Reagan had spoken about the Soviet Union as the foremost evil that we have faced in the modern age. Now, you may recall that the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War were both operating according to a principle known as mutually assured destruction. And that was based on the assumption that both sides wanted, at very least, to survive. Both sides wanted to live. And so they both were afraid to press the nuclear button and destroy the world. Neither of them wanted to do that. Neither of them wanted to bring death and destruction on so massive a scale onto the planet. We are now facing an enemy that mutually assured destruction will not work with. The principle does not hold because this foe says forthrightly, we love death. We will win because we love death more than you love life. This is something that Islamic jihadis have said repeatedly all over the world in many different contexts. Maulana Iyadullah, who was a jihad leader in Afghanistan right at the beginning of what became known as the War on Terror, he said, the Americans are coming, but they're certain to lose because the Americans love Pepsi Cola and we love death. That's what he said. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, when he was hiding out in the boat, you may recall that he had run into this man's yard and run into his boat. And in the boat, he found a marker and he started writing on the wall of the boat. And he wrote, we will win because we see paradise in the barrels of your guns. In other words, go ahead and kill us. We want that because we will go to paradise as a result, or so he thinks. Now this is at very root, and that shows it, an ideological conflict. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev did what he did because he believes certain things. And the one thing that Barack Obama tells us, and that John Kerry and Joe Biden and the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Cameron, and virtually every other authority in the Western world, is that what the people like Dzhokhar Tsarnaev say they're doing is not really what they're doing. And what they say they believe is not really what they believe. And the reason why they're doing what they're doing, as they themselves explain it, none of that is really true. And that a group that calls itself the Islamic State and proclaims itself as being the fullest embodiment of the principles of the religion of Islam actually has nothing to do with Islam and is not Islamic. This is what every analyst pretty much in the mainstream will tell you. The only problem with it is that it is absolutely 100% and wholly false. Now, why does that matter? It's a very old principle of warfare. If you do not understand your enemy, you will not defeat him. If you do not know your enemy, you will not be able to formulate proper ways to meet the challenge that he poses to you because you don't even understand what that challenge is. We're in a situation like that today. If you have your Quran with you, just open it up now to chapter 47. If you didn't bring it, it's okay, I'll leave it out. But the Quran, the Holy Book of Islam, is the book that the jihadis constantly point to and say, we're doing it because the book says this. We're doing it because the book says that. This is why we are doing what we do. And you will find our motives and our goals all completely set out in this book. And yet this is the one thing that Obama, Cameron, Kerry, Biden, all of them, they all say, well, we don't have to pay any attention to that book. We know that has nothing to do with it. But let's just give them the benefit of the doubt. The Islamic State. The Islamic State has declared war on the United States. It has said that it's going to fly the black flag of jihad over the White House. and kill Obama. It said that they're going to make the United States and the rest of the world into an Islamic state. I'll tell you right now, I don't think they're really going to do that. But they could kill quite a lot of people in trying to. That seems actually something that they could very easily do. The Islamic State explains that they are at war with the United States and that they want to kill so many of us because of principles that are in the Islamic Holy Book. So let's look at what the Islamic State does in light of the complete denial that this has anything to do with Islam. Barack Obama says that they behead people, and when they behead people, this is completely against the principles of Islam. So if you have your Quran, chapter 47, verse 4, it says, when you meet the unbelievers, strike their necks. When you meet the unbelievers, strike their necks. This Quran, by the way, it's very useful. This is a very interesting story. I got this Quran a few years ago. I was in London, and I was filming a documentary, but I had a lot of downtime. And so I did what any American tourist in London would do. I visited the local mosques. And in one of the mosques, I went to this was in the Finsbury Park Mosque. The Finsbury Park Mosque, about 10 years ago, was notorious around the world for being the mosque where the imam, the head of it, was this man. He was known popularly as Captain Hook. His name was Abu Hamza al-Masri. And he was called Captain Hook because he had blown off his hands making a bomb. And he had lost an eye in both his hands. He had these hooks for hands. And he was ultimately arrested and imprisoned for various terrorist-related activities. He was then extradited to the United States, where he is in prison today, because he was trying to set up an Al-Qaeda training camp in Oregon. Anybody here from Oregon? I guess this is the New England Conference. I was always bad, Joe. Anyway, I was actually telling myself, I think we should do the New England Conference in Southern California. But anyway, the weather will clear up. The Captain Hook, Abu Hamza al-Masri, he was the leader of the Finsbury Park Mosque, the imam of the Finsbury Park Mosque. And he was teaching jihad and killing the infidels and conquering Britain and making it Islamic and so on. When he was removed and imprisoned, then a different group of people came in and took control of the mosque. I went in at that time and I said, I understand you had a little bit of trouble here a few years ago. And they said, yes, we did, but there were some extremists here, but they're all gone and now we're all moderates. And they were very happy to have visitors. They gave me this Quran, they gave me a lot of other books, hoping I would convert to Islam. And I found this Quran very, very useful because it doesn't just have the translation of the text into English, but it also has commentary by Sayyid Abu Ala Maududi, who was a Pakistani politician and scholar of Islam. He wrote a multi-volume commentary on the Quran that you can get at your local Islamic bookstore next time you're there. And he also wrote many, many things about various aspects of Islam. When you go to your local Islamic bookstore, if you were to go to islamicbookstore.com or islamicity.com, you'll find a lot of books by Maududi. He is very, very mainstream. He's not some marginal extremist. And he writes commentary that is very illuminating so that you can say, well, I didn't just hear all this from that guy that Media Matters says is such a bad guy, but this is actually more mainstream within Islam. The Islamic State beheads people. What else do they do? One of the things that they do, you may recall, that got them to be so notorious was that they captured a lot of women who were not Muslim, Christians and Yazidis, and they forced them into sex slavery. Now this sounds impossibly lurid, and I'm sorry to even bring it up, but it's amazing that that would even be happening in the 21st century. This is now right, yeah. And it's astonishing to read these things and think we're not reading Marco Polo or something from 1,000 years ago. This is now. And they say once again that they're doing this, it's simply because of Islam. And Barack Obama says, no, 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 it isn't. So let's look again at the record. The Quran in chapter 4, verse 3 says, if you marry the women that seem good to you, 2 or 3 or 4, if you fear that you will not be able to treat them justly, then marry only one, or marry from among those whom your right hands possess. Now what does that mean? Those whom your right hands possess. Well, let's see what Maududi says. Maududi explains the verse. He says this, This expression denotes slave girls, i.e. female captives of war, who are distributed by the state among individuals when no exchange of prisoners of war takes place. Now, is that not what the Islamic State did? Exactly. And yet, Maududi died in 1979. He never heard of the Islamic State. He was actually the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami, which is still the largest Islamist political party in Pakistan. Now, these girls whom the right hands possess, let's just make it absolutely clear what they are for. The Quran says at the beginning of chapter 23, the believers have indeed attained true success. Those who, in their prayers, humble themselves, so far so good, who avoid whatever is vain and frivolous, no problem there, who observe zakah, that's almsgiving, it's good, fine, who strictly guard their private parts, except from their wives or those whom their right hands possess. So that makes it pretty clear what this is all about. And the Islamic State can and does point to verses like that and say, we're doing this because this is Islam. Now here again, why does this matter, whether they are going by the book or not? The question is this: Barack Obama has vowed to destroy the Islamic State, right? And you understand, of course, I'm speaking about the group he refers to as ISIL, and that the rest of the world calls ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Shams, which is what they used to call themselves. Shams is the area of the Mediterranean around Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Jordan, and the translation of it most common into English is Levant. And so you get the Islamic State of Iraq in the Levant, ISIL or ISIL, and the Islamic State of Iraq in Shams or Syria, ISIS. But they call themselves just the Islamic State. They actually dropped the second half of the name. The thing is, why does it matter? If Barack Obama is going to do something that has never been done before in the history of aviation, he's going to conquer a territory by air alone. Airstrikes are going to defeat this thing, and so we can all hail his wisdom in that. But the fact is that the conquering of the Islamic State, what will it accomplish? That's the question before us. Think about this. If the Islamic State is not Islamic, as Barack Obama insists, it has nothing to do with Islam, then once he does conquer it from the air, then everything will be okay. This problem will have gone away. Smooth sailing from there on out. But if the Islamic State is working from established principles within Islam that other Muslims may also follow, then these kinds of problems will keep coming up elsewhere. And we have a much bigger problem and a different kind of problem on our hands. And this is why it's very important to get clarity on these issues, which is the one thing we don't have in Washington. Now, another thing they did when they moved into the city of Mosul in Iraq, in Mosul, there was a large Christian population that had been there since the beginning of Christianity, 2,000 years, and longer than the Muslims. And in Mosul, they went and painted the Arabic letter Nun, which is corresponding to the letter N, and it stands for Nasara, which is the Arabic, the Quran's word, I should say, for Christians, Nazarenes. The Quran always refers to the Christians as Nazarenes, and the first letter of that is the Nun for Nasara. They painted that on the houses of the Christians in order to mark them so that they would know who to come back to and demand money from. Now, this was not just a shakedown. This was not just extortion or paying protection. This was in accord with chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran, which says, fight against those who do not obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not forbid what He has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book, which is the Quran's designation primarily for Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya, which is a tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. So the idea is that the Muslims are commanded to fight against the Christians and the Jews and others until they submit to the Muslims. They are subdued, they are willingly submitting and paying this tax from which the Muslims are exempt. The Islamic State coming into Mosul, they saw this was not being done. Saddam Hussein did not follow Islamic law when he was governing Iraq. And so they told the Christians, you've got to pay this tax, or convert to Islam, or we will kill you. Now in that they must be completely misunderstanding Islam, right? So let's go to see what Maududi says about that particular verse. It says, the purpose for which the Muslims are required to fight. You notice he doesn't say invited to fight or asked to fight or exhorted to fight or encouraged to fight, but required to fight, is not, as one might think, to compel the unbelievers into embracing Islam. It's not about forced conversion. Rather, its purpose is to put an end to the suzerainty, the rule, the hegemony, the suzerainty of the unbelievers, so that the latter are unable to rule over people. You notice how universal that statement is. He's not just saying the unbelievers should not be able to rule over Muslim lands, or should not be able to invade Iraq, or should not be able to establish the state of Israel. He's saying the unbelievers should not be able to rule over people, any people. He goes on, the authority to rule should only be vested in those who follow the true faith. Unbelievers who do not follow this true faith should live in a state of subordination, so not having equal rights with the Muslims. Anybody who becomes convinced of the truth of Islam may accept the faith of his or her own volition. The unbelievers are required to pay jizya, the poll tax, in return for the security provided to them as the dhimmis, the protected people of the Islamic State. Jizya symbolizes the submission of the unbelievers to the rule of Islam. The submission of the unbelievers to the rule of Islam. So when they went into Mosul, that's what they were doing. They were making sure that the unbelievers were submitting to the hegemony of Islam. This was in accord, once again, with Quranic principles. You may have heard also recently that the Islamic State jihadis went into the museum in Mosul. Did you see the news on that? And started to smash up the ancient artifacts, 3,000-year-old Assyrian statues. And they took sledgehammers and smashed them to bits. If you studied any anthropology or any ancient history, you probably saw the winged horses of the Assyrians and so on. They're gone, destroyed. And there were two ancient cities where a great deal of this art still existed that they went into also and smashed up and left it in absolute rubble, ruins. Now, why on earth would they do that? That's just absolute anti-civilization, anti-human savagery. These things can never be replaced. There are no more Assyrian artists who can make that kind of thing. They're just gone. Why would they do that? Well, the Quran says in chapter 3, verse 137, that if you are skeptical about, the context is that it's saying, if you don't believe what's being revealed, then go about the land and see the destiny of those who rejected Allah. And the idea is that the ruins of ancient civilizations show forth the judgment of Allah on the people who rejected Him, the people who were pagans and worshipped other gods. The rubble, the ruins, show the power of Allah, the victory of Allah, and the judgment of Allah. Now, He doesn't make the ruins. The people, the Muslims, have to make them. The Quran says, make war on them. Allah will punish them through you. In other words, the Muslims are the executors of the wrath of Allah. When they make ruins, that is something that shows the power of Allah. The more ruins, the more power of Allah, the better off it is. And so this is a complete rejection of anything having any validity or any value outside of their purview and their understanding of Islam. And a total challenge, if you think about what could happen, a total challenge to the patrimony of Western civilization and to the physical artifacts of the civilization, that the values of which we hold dear and are dedicated to defending. Imagine what people of the Islamic State might do if they get to Rome, as they have boasted, if they get to France, if they get to England, if they get to Washington, as they have promised to do. Then you can just imagine what would happen to the Vatican, to the Cathedral of Notre Dame, to the White House, and so on. Now, the question is, what are we going to do about this? In the first place, obviously I was not being serious before in saying that they can be defeated by airstrikes alone. But even a ground force of military action is extraordinarily problematic because, well, you know, we just had ground troops in Iraq, and Barack Obama pulled them out, and the Islamic State arose and took advantage of that. Now that was entirely to be expected. But then on the other hand, what are you going to do? Keep them there forever? And make Iraq the 51st state? That doesn't seem very practical either. And so the question is really what needs to be done is to challenge the assumptions that lead to this kind of behavior. And that is where nobody has dared to go. And the United States has not done. I can tell you that when the American troops went into Afghanistan and toppled the Taliban, and when they went into Iraq and toppled Saddam Hussein, then they stayed, right? And they stayed in order to build the nations back up. And what George W. Bush wanted to do was create Western-style secular republics in both countries, correct? You heard this? However, what really was done was that in both countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States oversaw the adoption of constitutions that said Islamic law is the highest law of the land. In both